Not much more than a century ago, the idea of the airplane as a weapon of war would have been regarded as little more than a pipe dream, a nebulous concept that most military strategists couldn't even imagine in any real detail. But just 120 years after the first powered airplane took to the skies, air power has become an indispensable part of warfare. From surveillance to aerial combat to bombardment and logistical transport, the airplane is arguably the most important piece of kit that any modern military can possess. In war after war, control of the skies is equated nearly directly to control over the entire battlefield, and although aircraft, like any technology, can't win a war all by themselves, it can certainly get you close. In this installment of our Art of War series, we're going to be diving deep into air supremacy, why it's important, how it's achieved, when it's been most critical throughout history, and what the battle for control of the skies might look like in the years to come. So, if we're going to talk about achieving air supremacy, we first got to define exactly what we're talking about, specifically the balance of power that exists between two or more forces in battle. Now, it's important that we don't constrain ourselves here to thinking simply of planes versus planes either, since the situation on land, on water, or even in space can have a substantive impact on who's winning an aerial battle. But it's the air battle that takes center stage today, and we can conceptualize the balance of power along a sliding scale from worst to best case scenarios, as described by NATO and the US Department of Defense. Starting on the bad end, there's a situation referred to as aerial incapability. This is a situation where one side of a conflict either can't get their aerial assets in the air or simply doesn't have any aerial assets to fight with. This might be because their planes or helicopters or drones were destroyed on the tarmac, or in the case of many insurgent groups, they just might not have any planes at all. A slightly better situation than that is aerial denial, where even if that side does have planes and helicopters that can take to the sky, it's too dangerous to enter the spaces that matter, be it over a battlefield or a critical asset on the ground. The enemy's own air power is simply too well concentrated or too dominant to risk engaging. Then there are sort of neutral situations, an unfavorable balance, parity, and a favorable balance. These are exactly what they sound like. In unfavorably contested airspace, your side is holding their own but not really doing great, and without some change of circumstances, they're on track to lose. In a situation of parity, we've got two evenly matched sides where nobody holds a real advantage over the other. And in favorably contested airspace, your side is winning and is probably on track to win the overall engagement as long as the enemy doesn't have any unexpected tricks up their sleeve. And then we get to the dominant side of the spectrum, the place where you really want to be as an aerial commander. Aerial superiority or aerial supremacy. Air superiority is a degree of aerial control that's strong enough that your own side, with its combined land, air, and sea forces, could basically do what it wants, when it wants, with the enemy being unable to present enough of an aerial threat that any of your operations would have to be paused in order to deal with them. And finally, there's air supremacy. Your forces hold complete control of the skies. Nobody flies without you knowing about it, and if there's a plane in the air that you don't want flying, well, it's not going to be flying for very much longer. So that's what air supremacy is, but how does a military force make air supremacy happen? Historically speaking, the best way to gain air supremacy isn't actually a matter of aerial combat, but instead a quick surgical strike that eliminates enemy air power while it's still on the ground. Aircraft are a lot easier to hit on the tarmac, after all, than they are in the air, and they can't shoot back, at least not with any serious effect. Alternatively, a force can attack the enemy's fuel depots, constraining enemy aircraft to little more than a single flight, even if they're lucky enough to be fueled up when the bombardment takes place. Runways are also a prime target, either so that planes can't take off, or better yet, so that they're stranded in the skies and forced to crash land. And sabotage carried out by special operating forces can rig an entire enemy airfield with explosives before official hostilities even begin. If air-to-ground attacks fail, or they aren't feasible to begin with, then the aerial balance of power will next be decided in pilot versus pilot engagements once both sides have planes in the air. Here we get the dogfights and the heat-seeking missile chases that you've seen in film or television, the grueling battles where aircraft performance, pilot intellect, and limited ammunition are what makes the difference between life and death. Questions of the sophistication of one's fighter aircraft become absolutely central here, be it World War I-style combat between biplanes armed with machine guns or 21st century air battles in which a plane could shoot its adversary out of the sky before even being detected. Those who win these battles can transform so-called contested airspace into a situation of air superiority or even supremacy, depending on the scale and scope of their combat successes. And finally, there's the countermeasures that a military can take without having to put aircraft into the sky at all: surface-to-air missiles, anti-air guns, and electronic weapons, among others. Although the active forces here are stuck on the ground, they can dramatically reduce enemy air power, especially when these sorts of defenses can be layered a few kilometers deep into one's own territory or coordinated between, say, the ships in a naval fleet. In situations where the enemy has already achieved air superiority, ground-to-air measures can level the playing field, and in cases where the enemy thinks they can get away with a preemptive strike on your aircraft, ground-to-air weapons are a valuable way to turn the tables or even cripple the enemy's air forces without ever having to launch your own. No matter how you get it done, establishing air superiority opens up a whole range of options for a military force. Bombers can attack the front lines, the supply lines, or the centers of population and industry. Fighter and attack aircraft can strafe troops on the ground or sink ships. Troop transport planes can insert land-based forces wherever they want, and valuable munitions, supplies, and personnel can be ferried rapidly around a war zone, basically unopposed. Reconnaissance planes can also venture far behind enemy lines, and massive air fleets can perform flyovers to intimidate military and political leaders on the other side of the war, using air power not just as an instrument of dominance, but as an instrument of fear. Now, although powered aircraft had seen limited wartime use as early as 1911, they really came into fashion during World War I from 1914 to 1918. No military of the period was really ready to fight an air war or even knew what they were doing in the skies, but they were eventually able to figure it out. First, unarmed reconnaissance planes started appearing over enemy battlefields, and then the other side would begin to realize that they'd have to send up planes with guns to get those spy planes to go away. Then somebody somewhere figured out that if you could put a gun on a plane, you could also put a bomb on one, and the first airplane bombardments began to pop up here and there. But once all sides began to enter into combat, innovation happened fast. The first issue they had to grapple with was how exactly to fire a machine gun without shooting their own propellers off, a problem that the Germans solved first when Dutch aircraft designer Anthony Fokker came up with a new way to time the firing of a gun so that the bullets passed seamlessly through the prop without hitting it. Early in the war, this gave Germany a huge advantage. They were the first to really figure out how to attack enemy aircraft, and their pilots gained invaluable experience attacking aerial targets. But when the Allied forces figured out a similar mechanism, they opened up a whole other dimension of combat: the dogfight. On all sides of the war, individual combat aces became incredibly valuable assets in the sky. A skilled pilot, one who truly had a knack for their aircraft and could gather experience piloting it, could easily take out 1 or 3 or 5 enemy pilots still trying to get a hang of their new technology. These battles became even more hard-fought when advancements in engine power and maneuverability allowed fighter planes to attack in 3 dimensions, diving down on their enemy or climbing up and turning to avoid someone attacking from behind. Pilots started developing better and better combat tactics, flying in teams or at high speeds with well-rehearsed maneuvers, and by the late years of the war, they were pulling off some truly exceptional combat feats. So too did planes become especially dangerous in a ground attack role, especially when they could harass a disorganized retreat by the enemy or strafe an enemy trench in a nice neat line. So impactful were these airstrikes that by the war's end, ground troops wouldn't move much except at night, and aircraft learned to use their range and altitude too, traveling into the enemy's backlines to destroy high-value targets that ground troops wouldn't be able to reach for months. After the war, a few forward-looking theorists were able to see the importance of air power, and that it was only going to grow in future conflicts. The foremost among them was an Italian general named Giulio Douhet, who gave the world not only a fabulous moustache, but a revolutionary new way to conceptualize the value of air power. Informed by the experiences of World War I, where air power had been a meaningful element of battles but was rarely a deciding factor, most military leaders of the early 1920s believed that wars would continue to be settled on land and at sea. But Douhet believed that air power could have real ramifications for the battle on the ground, and that, hypothetically speaking, a war between two evenly matched land forces could be decided by air support from one side or the other, rather than in a war of attrition like World War I had been known for. Planes could bomb cities, they could gain command of a battlefield from the skies, and they could be used to decide the course of a war and force one side to surrender before a ground battle had even taken place. Duhay wasn't necessarily a believer in fighter aircraft on their own merit, but believed that a military force who could use fighter aircraft to clear a path for their bombers would quickly cause the enemy to capitulate. Now, for those of us who are familiar with interwar generals, it should be no surprise that Duhay's colleagues mostly dismissed these ideas out of hand. But across the pond, in the United States, a general named Billy Mitchell was hard at work trying to convince his own superiors that air power was the way of the future. As Mitchell saw it, aircraft could subdue centers of industry, terrify troops on the ground, or win dogfights in the skies in order to set up more powerful bombing runs like Duhay described. To prove his point, he carried out live fire experiments against captured German battleships, where in his first experiment, a small fleet of bombers took less than half an hour to sink one such ship. Unfortunately, Mitchell didn't win many friends for suggesting that the prized American battleship fleet was fallible by a few planes, and he was even court-martialed for his troubles, but his assessments turned out to be well ahead of his time. Now, by the time World War II came around, the world had a new asset: the monoplane, which boasted far greater performance and the potential for much better firepower than even the most fearsome biplane. For those who had cared enough to look, Imperial Japan was already showing the value of air power over Chinese forces even before hostilities broke out in Europe. But by and large, Western military doctrine still did not appreciate the value of aerial warfare capabilities. The exception was Nazi Germany, which had already gotten its pilots plenty of valuable experience in the Spanish Civil War, and whose air force, the Luftwaffe, were more than able to steamroll Poland, France, and the other targets of the German blitzkrieg in the early years of the war. But the Luftwaffe were at their best as close air support fighters who could work directly in concert with ground troops in order to clear out enemy defenses and attack the back lines with fighter pilots who were trained to keep their bomber forces protected on short, frequent bombing runs. And this was all well and good, until the Battle of Britain, where they went head-to-head with British airmen who understood perfectly how to use their geography to their advantage. You see, German air raids over the British Isles required strategic bombers to fly long distances, release their payload, and get home safely protected by fighter aircraft who could consistently win dogfights without any major loss of personnel or aircraft. Not only were Luftwaffe pilots largely unequipped for this kind of aerial combat, but they were going up against British Spitfires and Hurricane aircrafts, which were optimized to defend British airspace in high-paced, constant dogfights. The British use of radar to provide early warning to their pilots and anti-aircraft guns and radio to help fighters once they were in the air provided serious advantages over the Luftwaffe. So, although the Luftwaffe were able to facilitate effective bombing raids for much of the conflict, they ran out of planes and qualified pilots much quicker than the British did, and even though the Luftwaffe attempted to target enemy airfields as much as they could, they badly overestimated the impact they'd had on the Royal Air Force. In what turned out to be an aerial war of attrition, British airmen and ground crews were increasingly able to turn their skies into a meat grinder for the Luftwaffe, whose supply chain issues, lack of heavy bombers, and slow pace of producing replacement aircraft eventually proved to be too much to overcome. After months of heavy fighting, the British were able to lock down control of the skies, achieving clear air superiority by shredding any German aircraft that dared attack British airspace. But the losses of the Battle of Britain could not compare to the ones sustained during Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, dubbed Operation Barbarossa by Nazi high command. Here, on the Eastern Front, Hitler's use of air power aligned far closer with what the Luftwaffe had been expecting, a grinding, slow march forward on the ground from which German fighter planes and light bombers could help force a long series of incremental gains. The Luftwaffe committed 4 of its 5 air fleets to the attack, and within 1 week of the attack beginning, they were able to destroy over 4,000 Soviet aircraft in the sort of air-to-ground devastation that practically guarantees air supremacy. However, a combination of logistical issues on the German side and the introduction of the MiG-3 high-altitude fighter plane and the Il-2 Sturmovik attack aircraft made by the Soviet Union's robust manufacturing industry eventually spelled doom for the Luftwaffe anyway. Much like in the Battle of Britain, lagging supply chains and limited opportunities to repair aircraft took more and more German planes out of the sky, and once the cruel Russian winter set in, that was the end. Many German planes couldn't be started unless fires were set under their engines, and the German mechanics' tools had a bad habit of freezing onto their hands. Germany slowly lost their air supremacy, and then their air superiority, and then even their parity, until the situation was so badly broken down that the Germans couldn't even sustain an airlift to retreat out of Stalingrad. Then there's the Pacific Theater, which provided a very different view on aerial warfare, where it was a crucial augmentation to both the Allied and Japanese approach to naval combat throughout the 1940s. Early Japanese successes came on the back of their ability to destroy major numbers of Allied warplanes where they sat on the ground, including America's B-17 bombers in the Philippines and hundreds of aircraft damaged or destroyed in the attack on Pearl Harbor. However, the real bulk of early engagements came via aircraft carrier battles and via small fleets of airplanes that could be launched from a range of Pacific islands. Despite Japan's early air superiority, the United States was able to push back at the Battle of the Coral Sea and turned the tide at Midway, both of which were battles where the loss of an aircraft carrier spelled doom for many pilots who now had nowhere to land, even if they survived an aerial dogfight. Despite the number of planes available to both sides overall, Japan and the Allies could only make use of the planes that they could fit onto a carrier, often accompanied by the best pilots of the entire Pacific Theater, meaning that the loss of even a handful of planes and pilots had catastrophic consequences. Not only that, but Japan was over-reliant on the Mitsubishi Zero fighter, which at the start of the war was universally admired and feared for its maneuverability and capacity to do massive damage, but like all major technological innovations, eventually the Allies were able to develop their own competitor aircrafts, and once they did, Japan's Zero fighters were quickly outclassed. By the time the Allies took control of the Philippines and Okinawa, they had secured clear air superiority over the Pacific and could encroach on the Japanese home islands. If Imperial Japan had indeed been invaded by land, then the Allies would likely have had uncontested control of Japan's airspace. But the United States' decision to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Japanese cities ended the war before that could happen. World War II also featured the debut of the jet-powered aircraft, a game-changing technology that would rewrite the rules of aerial engagement. Despite hopes that the world might have a peaceful few years after the war's end, it wasn't long before hostilities kicked off again, this time in Korea, where the US Air Force was caught badly off guard by a southward advance by the North Korea People's Army. The Air Force's doctrine at the time had called for nearly single-minded investment in long-range strategic bombers in order to project the threat of nuclear war. But this had an adverse impact in Korea, where there were relatively few targets that required heavy bombers, and quite a lot where fast, nimble attack aircraft would have been far more useful. While the US was very successful in conducting air raids on tank columns and supply lines, China's support of the North Koreans ended up providing substantial anti-aircraft artillery and helped North Korean troops better evade American air power. At the same time, American F-86 Sabre fighters began to go head-to-head with Soviet-made MiG-15 jets, especially over Southwest Korea. Here, with neither side able to support their pilots very much from the ground, pilot versus pilot dogfights were the deciding factor on who controlled the airspace at a given time. Compared to inexperienced North Korean and Chinese pilots and a small number of covert Soviet pilot units, the American pilots were far superior, informed by their experiences in World War II. Despite their relatively equal specs and abilities, 10 MiG-15 jets would be lost for every American Sabre that was shot down, proving that pilot skill would remain the most important dogfighting advantage in the jet age. And in Korea, both sides, but especially the United States, learned to excel at taking advantage of their controlled airspace in order to conduct airlifts and supply drops. New helicopters had a massive impact. But whether by fixed wing or rotorcraft, the Korean War was a major turning point in learning just what to do with air superiority once it was secured. The technological contrasts of the Cold War substantively changed the way the world approached aerial combat, both via advancements on the ground and the continual arrival of newer and better planes in the sky. In the early 1960s, the world began to reckon with the efficacy of surface-to-air missiles and air defense radar, prompting the emergence of such tactics as flying low to the ground when possible in order to evade enemy radar. Ballistic missiles replaced much of the work of strategic nuclear bombers, and the pursuit and eventual introduction of stealth technology changed the game in their own right, culminating with the introduction of the F-22 Raptor. But even before the F-22, other planes made big contributions to the way the world thought about aerial warfare. The F-14 Tomcat, the SR-71 Blackbird, the A-10 Warthog, the Harrier jump jet, and the B-52 bomber for the West, and the Tu-95 bomber and the MiG-21, 31, and Su-27 fighter jets for the Soviets. From Vietnam to the Falklands, to the Soviet war in Afghanistan, every conflict of the period forced new innovations and new adaptations in doctrine to keep up. During these years, Israel proved itself to be exceptionally adept in imposing air supremacy over the Middle East, and often on short notice. And this was no accident. Israel's territory is geographically small enough that it could be easily overrun if its Arab neighbors took control of the skies, so much of Israeli defensive doctrine has been centered around protecting its airspace and using air power to cause outsized damage on the ground. In 1967, Israel was able to destroy much of the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces where their planes sat on the tarmac, seizing air supremacy in just days, and they would deny any challenge to their air superiority during wars in 1973 and 1982. In the latter conflicts, Israeli fighter aircraft were able to shoot down some 85 Syrian planes with no air-to-air losses of Israeli planes. Even today, Israel retains clear air superiority in the Middle East, with dominance bordering on constant air supremacy. In the years during and after the fall of the Soviet Union, Western air superiority has been the linchpin of nearly all intervention efforts. During the 1991 Gulf War, a US-led multinational coalition attained air superiority within just hours of the start of the battle, sweeping over Iraq's robust integrated air defense system, taking out Iraq's radar and communications, and knocking out centralized command and control almost immediately. With this done, the Iraqi Air Force was all but neutralized, and the coalition took no confirmed air-to-air losses during the conflict. During the NATO intervention in Kosovo in 1999, Western powers flew over 38,000 sorties without suffering a single death on NATO's side, and amidst the combined pressure of the threat of a ground invasion, these air raids were able to force a rapid conclusion to the conflict. And in wars between smaller regional powers, acrimonious neighbor countries, or even during civil conflicts, forces that can establish air superiority are, as a rule, very well equipped to defeat their adversaries. After decades of mostly one-sided air campaigns, the Syrian civil war provided a fascinating opportunity for world power air forces to meet on opposite sides of a conflict, even if those major powers did their best to not bite directly. With the Western Air Power Coalition backing Syria's rebel factions and Russia backing the ruling regime of Bashar al-Assad, both sides' air interventions ran a near constant risk of falling afoul of the other. Although Syrian airspace has been firmly under the control of nations other than Syria for most of the conflict, both Russia and the Western coalition coordinated closely to avoid any direct confrontations in a situation which prevented either side from actually gaining air superiority in the region. This unique situation, with both sides very clearly dancing around the other, set a fascinating precedent for future conflicts in which major powers have conflicting interests in a third country but would rather avoid another world war. One conflict where there's been no dancing around, though, is in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the skies over much of Ukraine have been tightly contested for more than a year. Despite initial expectations that Russia's Air Force's larger, more advanced air fleet would overrun Ukrainian air power in a matter of days, Ukraine has been able to make up the difference using surface-to-air munitions. Although Ukraine's Air Force has been unable to secure its own airspace or fight head-to-head with Russian pilots, their ground-based defenses have inflicted losses including dozens of Russian planes and helicopters. Rather than continuing to push vulnerable warplanes into Ukrainian airspace, Russia has instead chosen to pull back and invest in the use of drones and missiles, which Ukraine has responded to by beefing up their air defenses and using their own drones and missiles in response. With help of foreign aid, Ukraine has been able to keep at least some control of its own skies and has outright denied Russia air superiority. Although the situation is somewhat favorable to Russia, Ukraine has continued to hold out in something close to a stalemate and has even claimed to shoot down Russian Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. So, as we look to the future of aerial warfare, technological innovation will continue to decide which nations can expect to enter air combat at an advantage or a disadvantage. At times, a nation with a significant enough technological advantage might achieve de facto air supremacy in future conflicts without firing a shot, with even more advanced stealth systems, directed energy weapons, drone swarms, and next-generation electronic warfare capabilities all on the horizon. To answer this call, many militaries around the world are hard at work developing 5th and 6th generation fighter aircraft, many of which have already been covered over on our sister channel Mega Projects. Just as important are a nation's ability to sustain its air force, keep its planes and pilots in a fight, and leverage controlled airspace to its fullest extent. And as always, airspace defense and denial will be just as important as the ability to win fights in the air. Nations that can protect their own airspace through surface-to-air weapons, electronic measures, and other ground defenses will continue to have their own advantages, and if those technologies can stay ahead of whatever's in the air, then even the best next-generation aircraft can be made obsolete. What isn't likely to change is just how critical air supremacy will be to the conflicts of the future, just as it's been absolutely central to the conflicts of the last century. The ability to control airspace doesn't necessarily equate to winning a war, but it'll get you bloody close. When two relatively equal sides enter a conflict, the one whose air force can better adapt to the needs of the moment is the one who's likely to gain some massive leverage on the other as time goes on. And when conflicts arise in which one side has a clear aerial advantage, it'll be up to the other side to either find some way to fight back, or otherwise sue for peace. In the 21st century, air supremacy itself reigns supreme, and that's not going to change anytime soon.